Hey, this is Wes. In this video, I want to walk you through the process of how I create procedural materials just directly in Substance Painter. So here's a look at the material, and I'm going to walk you through each layer step by step. All right, so we got a lot to cover. Let's check it out. So the first thing that I start with is this plane, and it's 2 meter by 2 meter, and you can see that the UVs fill the full 0 to 1 space so that it will repeat seamlessly. And I subdivided this up by a ton, like 100. So now I'm here in Substance Painter and I've imported this plane, and let's start taking a look at the layer stack. So first things first, I'm going to enable this concrete layer, and this is just a material that I grabbed from the starter assets in Substance Painter, and it is actually set to tile by 3. So, and it's just a visual like, oh, okay, that looked pretty good. You'll see once we kind of get this in place, but I just tiled it by 3. So now what we want to start to look at is our height information. So if I enable this layer, we can start to look at what we have. So what I have here is just a folder, and I'm using this just for organizational purposes. Inside of this folder, I have 2 layers of height. Now, if we look at the first one, it's set to base, and that material, it just has the height channel enabled, and the height value is set to 0. You know what I should do is really set that to 0. Okay. Now the next layer, if I enable it, you can see that it also has a height value and it has some height intensity towards the positive range. So let's take a look at what this mask looks like. First and foremost, I'm using this brick generator. So as soon as I enable that, we can start to see this height information now. And I am using the brick generator, which ships with Substance Painter. So if you just come over to textures and you do a search here for brick, you'll see the brick generator shows up. And this has a lot of cool controls and things like that, lots of things to check out. But the real interesting thing is this height variation. So I'm going to take a look at the mask, and you can see the height variation, which is right here. If it's set to, like, say something like 0, you don't really get any height variation. Well, I am a little bit because I'm also using slope. So you can see I can change the slope values here too, which is cool. But I had this height variation set to something like this, which randomizes basically the height values. So dark and light, and then it just makes the bricks, some of them are pushing up, some of them are more kind of dug into the surface. And so that's where I end up getting this displacement. Now, speaking of displacement, if we jump over here to our shader settings, you can see that for the displacement and tessellation, I have my scale set to like 0.25 and the subdivision count. Now, the thing to think about is these 2 values, they're just arbitrary. They're going to be specifically set inside whatever renderer you're using. Like in this case, I rendered this in Blender using cycles. And for the displacement node that's created in my material, that value doesn't really correlate 1-to-1 to this value inside of Substance Painter. So one thing that I probably could do would be like maybe set like a value of 1 in here, export that, and then try to work out what the difference is. But really, I just kind of eyeball it and see what it looks like. But just know that these values here are arbitrary. What really matters is the height values that you're adding into your texture maps. So that's how I'm getting this height information. And again, if we look at this bricks, you can see it gets a little positive height. Now, the next thing that I do, so I can start to really see some shape and form to this, which I feel like is the most important part of the material creation process, is if we jump over here to our filters, and I'll do a search for ambient occlusion, we have this horizon-based ambient occlusion filter, and you can drag and drop and just add that right to your layer stack. Whenever you drag and drop a filter into the layer stack, it will set all of the blending modes to pass through, which basically just means for all the channels, which basically means it's going to take data from below and pass that up through into the layer. So think of this layer as being like a box, and it collects all the layers below its data into that box. And you can also stack filters, right? So if I wanted to throw levels on top of this, I could and say, hey, ambient occlusion. And now I am getting ambient occlusion data, and I'm also able to tweak it with the levels. So to show you that, if I enable my ambient occlusion information, this is what I'm starting to get here. So now we're getting a little bit more shading, and I can go to the horizon-based ambient occlusion filter. Its channel is set to source, which is height, and I can increase the height depth and the radius, but now I have this levels. I could also play around with the levels here if I want to darken or control this. Now, in order for this to take effect, you need to make sure that you go to your texture set settings and add an ambient occlusion channel. Hit the plus button, and I've already added it, so it's not here, but it would be here in the list, ambient occlusion. Okay, so now we have that channel. Let's go back and take a look at that mask some more. So now that we have the mask, I want to start to kind of make some changes and variation to this. Now, never mind this stone layer. We'll talk about that towards the end of the video. It's pretty cool, so stick around for that. But what I'm going to do on top of this mask is add a slope blur. And so now this is just giving me some cool slope edges to these bricks. The thing to note about this is if I come into here and I look at the blending mode is set to min, but I'm also using a custom noise that I threw a Perlin noise into it and then tweaked it. You know, I don't know what the if you set this to like default noise, I'm trying to think of what the default noise is. It probably is a Perlin, but I'm not sure. It might be clouds. But anyways, you can change this. Now, the thing that's important about this, if you haven't used slope blur, let's zoom in on a little section here and we look at the blending mode. So by default, it's going to be set to blur. But if we look at min, basically think of it like this. Minimum takes the dark values and pushes it towards the light values. So if I increase the intensity down to 0 and as I move the intensity, this dark value is going to push into the light value like that. So it's like a carve. If you're using ZBrush, I think of it like a trim dynamic brush is what I'm doing. And then if you do the opposite, max is doing, well, the opposite. It's taking the light values and pushing those into the dark values. See how it's doing that? And then blur is a combination of both. So it's doing both. But we want minimum. So we're going to do that and then push that in, our little carve brush, right? So we carve that. Now I have my tiling set pretty low so that I'm getting these big shapes. So if the tiling was up, you would get something like this, but I just pulled the tiling down so I can just get some larger shapes like you see here. Then what I'm going to do is stack that with a slope blur, and it's set to screen. Let's see, if I think by default it would have been replace here. Does that? Yeah, see, it kind of gets this, it kind of crunched my values a little bit. So on this second one, I'm just trying to add the values together. So I just set this to be a screen here, and that's better. Now, the slope blur on this one is just using the default noise, and, you know, I'm just increasing the intensity and just getting a little bit of, you know, kind of a chunk like this. Okay, so now I've got this combination of both. And what this does is if we look at my material mode, it now lets me see, you know, it's just giving me lots of more detail in these bricks. Now, never mind this terrible crunching. We'll fix that later. But for now, I'm starting to get a look of what I want here. Now, the other reason why I have these two layers, right? So if I turn this base off, I lose my ambient occlusion. And so I just kind of want to bring this out because this can trip you out. So let's do this. Let's come in here and look at this ambient occlusion. So single channel ambient occlusion. This is what it is. And if I turn this off, let's see. No, actually, let's do this. It might be easier. Let's go to height. So if we look at just the height information from the first fill layer, it's doing so based on this mask that's being generated. Okay, and what I end up getting with that is some transparency, it looks like, in the mask, right? And so that there's no base value underneath of it. So when we try to pass that up to this ambient occlusion filter, the data is not all there, right? So that's why I come over here. Again, I'm viewing the height channel, and I just add a base layer that's at 0 to start from. And then this creates an appropriate height channel for me. So now that I have all this data, when I view my ambient occlusion, it looks correct. So moving up, we can now start to, well, actually, let's look at this. So one of the reasons I'm building everything like this is because now with this system, I am building in this capability to procedurally change things and have all the layers above it update. So for example, if I want to come over here to my bricks and I can change my bricks, I can change the Y, I can just do all kinds of changes, right? Check this out. If we go to the height variation, look how it starts to darken and occlude as the bricks go, you know, push down into the surface. That's awesome. I mean, I think that's so cool that it's working that way, right? It gets darker and then it gets lighter and then it gets darker. So pretty cool. But this system that's all seamless right now, again, it's going to build up to the data that we start using in the rest of the layer stack. And speaking of, let's look at our next layer, which is the grout layer. Okay, so we turn this on, and here's what it looks like by default. So what I did in this case is I took the concrete course, duplicated it, and just placed it above in the layer stack. And then for the material, I changed the color and dropped the concrete roughness down. So now it looks really shiny. Let's take a look at the mask. So the mask looks like this. And if we go into the fill, so I have my mask and I do a fill, and here's the first time we're going to start using what's called an anchor point. Okay, so here's the thing we got to understand first. If we look at this here in the layer stack, so I'm going to zoom in on this. Now, we have our top folder here, which is height. And inside of this, we have two fill layers. Both are working on height information. A base, which is 0, and another layer that has a mask that's generating some data on top of the base. Combining the two give me the height. And then those are sitting in a folder. And what I do is I'm saying, hey, pin this. Think of an anchor as like a pin. And this pin is basically taking the height data from here, the height data from here, that is also being, overridden or driven by this mask data, and it's grabbing all that and it's basically collecting it or pinning it at this point. So at this point in my layer stack, height is all of this and this here. So now we have a point, a pin, which is what I'm going to use everywhere else in my layer stack. So now we come over to the grout and I just create a mask and a fill. And for this fill, you just select the button, you go to your anchor points, and I choose height. And then I set the point here to height. And then what's really cool is it'll be like this. You can expand this levels. So you have this built-in levels. I could have easily added a levels effect on top of it here. And you know what? I mean, if you're working on a team, it's probably better to do that because you can look at it and say, oh, there's the levels, they're processing it. Here it's kind of hidden. So it's like, this is doing two things. It's getting my height information through an anchor, and it is running it through a levels, but it's kind of hidden, right? So, something to think about. But all I did was just crunch my input white, and I really contrasted this guy up, right? So now if we look, that's going to be my effect. And I could you can see the changes that I can make just by adjusting this. And this is all changing dynamically because of that height information that's coming up from the bottom. So remember that height information, if we look at it, it's got, this slope information, the height variation, all this kind of stuff, all those gray values are feeding up into it. So now this is what we're getting for the grout. So pretty cool. Now, the next thing is we're going to look at edges. So I'm going to enable my edges. And here on the edges, you can see it's doing just that. It's adding some edges. So let's look at this. It's a fill layer, and I've got all these color channels. I probably don't even need all that stuff, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm holding down the Option or Alt key. I can't remember what it is. I'm on Mac, so it's an Option, and just selecting just the color information. So I don't need all those other channels. And if we look at the mask for the edges, this is what it looks like. So let's take a look at this step by step. So first things first, in this mask, I add a fill through here. And again, I'm pulling that anchor data. So that single pin, you'll see it gets used over and over and over and over. And so I bring that guy in. And the first thing I did was I inverted it. So I click invert. So here's a great spot to use the levels. So I have the levels, I invert. So here's what it looks like. It comes in like this. I invert it and then kind of crunched it in. So here's what it comes in. Something like this, I think. Whoops, invert. So it comes in like this. And then we invert it, and then we just crunch the values in. Something like that. All right, and I'm just going to undo to get myself back. Okay, so now I have this mask. Then I'm going to use the mask outline, which is this guy here. This is a filter that you can get. So you just come over here and you said add filter and you do mask outline, and it's a pretty awesome tool because it has a couple positions. You got inside, outside, or both, a combination. In this case, I'm using inside. And now I have this little threshold value that I can play with, and a width and a blur, and it's just creating an edge mat for me. So then when I look at it in the mode, I get the fill. Then I do a mask outline. Now I've got my edges. And then, of course, you want to break those up by just adding like some type of grunge map on top of everything. So now I have a grunge map, and it's just multiplying on top of all this. And that's how I created the edges. Now, the next thing is going to be a bit of color variation. So if I enable color variation, I'm getting something that looks like this. All right, so this is a fill layer. And in this case, there's no channels. It's actually using pass-through right here. for all of my base color. So what you could do is just take a filter. So for example, if I grab a filter, like if I'm using HSL and you just drag it into your layer stack, this is a better way to probably do this, is it adds in the filter and it sets all the blending modes. So again, if I look at, say, something like metallic, it's set to pass through. Everything's set to pass through. Remember, pass through is taking all the layers below, passing them up through and parking them right here. So it's like a collection box, right? All that data's there. Works just like an adjustment layer. So you can do that. In my case, I'm kind of old school with my painter chops, so I didn't do that, which is kind of a newer way of working. I create a fill and then manually added the HSL. I'm just, muscle memory with that. So I put HSL on here, and then I played with saturation, lightness, hue, that kind of stuff. But then if we look at the mask to it, it looks like this. We have our fill. Again, here's what we're doing. We're grabbing that height anchor, okay? And then I just, I'm just kind of cranking around on the levels here to get an effect. So let's do, I don't know, I'm just kind of playing with it now. Let's see. Let's do maybe something like that. So now I've created this mask that's kind of varying degrees. Like some of it's, all this is getting change. Let's see. Let's do even something more like that. So then if I go to my material mode and I look, I turn this on and off, here's what I'm kind of getting, right? So I don't know, I kind of messed up what I had before. Let me just undo it. And here, we'll go back to our HSL. And then, like I said, I can play with the saturation to this guy, the lightness, so on and so forth, right? So it's just kind of adding more information. Then the next layer is going to be this dirt variation. So if I enable that, here's a dirt variation on top. And what this is again, another fill layer, only the color channel. I set a color value. I got the blending mode is just set to normal. I could use multiply, but let's see what I have here. And this one's really simple. It's just a grunge map that I threw in and just applied it this way. So yeah, super, super simple here. Now, the next thing that I'm doing on top of this guy is bringing in my roughness information. So now I do my roughness information. And this here is, again, another fill layer, only set to rough. And now I've got this little slider control where I can just kind of open, just kind of dial it in and out. So if we look at this kind of glancing angle right here where you can see some of that roughness, I can make it more rough or less rough, so on and so forth. So we'll do something like that. And this is being driven by just another mask that I threw in here. And again, I'm being kind of lazy. I'd probably, want to do some more layers, really vary it, but, I was just being quick about it. All right, so now I've got some new roughness in play. The next layer is going to be a dirt layer. So we turn this on. Here's what we're getting. This is a fill layer, just color. Here's my color value. And let's take a look at this mask. So we'll go into the mask. And if we look here, we get the fill. So you could use like a dirt generator. The problem is, because I'm trying to create this procedural tiling, is I don't have any baked data. And you can use anchor points inside generators, but it didn't really work very well for me in this case. So what I did was I just created a fill anchor point into that height, and I inverted it and just play with the levels, and you can see what I'm doing here. These occluded in between areas are what is white, meaning that's where the dirt is going to be collecting mainly. And then also these areas of the slope that are down low, because I did the invert, those are also going to get more dirt. So then I just add a black and white spots on top of it just to really, just grunge everything up. And then this is my dirt level. And so we could keep playing with this now, with this procedural control of this dirt. We could contrast it, do something like this. All right, so we're getting close. This is kind of like my base material here between, getting the shape and then mixing everything. Now, the next layer that I have here is this blur. We're going to come to this in a minute, okay? So, and this is actually, well, like I said, we'll come to this in a minute. Let's skip it. So the next thing that we're going to look at, I'm just kind of looking at a couple things here. All right, let's go to the next thing. The next thing is cool. This is a moss material. So I'm going to enable this guy, and now you can see that I get this moss material all over the place here in the scene. And this is blending based on some cool information. So this moss is coming from, and I made this in Substance Designer. It's in my materials. I brought it in. It's this guy. I made this in Substance Designer. I'll put a link in the description of the video so you can make sure that you get this moss material. So you just drag and drop it in, okay? And if let's just turn off everything and let's come over to the mask. And I'm using a special type of mask called compare mask. And it's here underneath the effect. You can add compare mask. And it's a super powerful tool because what it does is it basically compares data from the layer it's applied to, uses some type of comparison to all the layers below. So in this case, you can choose different channels too. So in this case, I'm using ambient occlusion information of this layer, and I'm comparing it. I'm seeing, hey, is it greater than all the layers below? So the green indicates here this layer's ambient occlusion, and this purple is all the layers below. And this teal value, where those values intersect, it turns teal, and that is this mask that's being created. Okay, and recall that I'm getting my ambient occlusion information from here. Because if we look into our layer stack way towards the bottom, where was this guy? I remember I used this effect, this ambient occlusion. And so now I have that information that I can use in my compare mask. So I do a compare mask. Now, to control the compare mask on the layer itself, so first thing you can see that I have this height turned off. Now I have this levels. I don't even need this anymore because I turned height off. But if I turn it on, it looks crazy in the viewport. And so here I was using height. If I just come into here, I was using height like this to control the height density of that. But you know what? I decided I don't want to mess with height. It's just really going to cause too much issue with subdivision. I don't need it. So I'll just delete this and go back to the height here and just turn that off. Okay, so that takes care of everything. Now, where everything really comes together is by adding a levels effect here that affects the ambient occlusion. So now I have my ambient occlusion, and if I push the output white towards the black, you can see that I can get this cool effect of, like, it's like a slider, right? It's like no moss. And then if I want to start to grow it, it starts to grow and appear first in these occluded areas, and then it just starts to creep out everywhere else where all that ambient occlusion is coming in. And eventually you can see it starts to creep alongside the stone itself here. So check this out. It'll just go in and do this. So it's just like this moss growing on everything, which is kind of cool. So that's how that effect works. All right, so now the next thing I want to talk about is this terrible stretching that we're getting here with displacement, because this is just displacing straight up. And it makes sense why it's happening. If we look at the height mask that we've been working on, I mean, you have really stark difference. You've got this white, little bit of gray because of the slope blur, and then boom, black. So it's like, it's giving me this really crazy, like, extruded surface here. It's terrible. However, a cool fix for that is this. We can come over here, and I can show you where it is in here. It's right here, this blur, and we're just going to call this displace fix blur. So what I did is I looked over here in my layer stack, and I grabbed, whoops, it's in the filters, right? So we do blur. I just grabbed a blur filter and just drug it right into the layer stack. Again, it sets everything to pass through. So at this point in the layer stack, again, think of it this way. It's like an adjustment layer. And all of these layers below, they're getting pulled up into this. And then on this blur, I'm able to blur just the height channel. So if we come over here and do this, and I'll show you what this is doing here. Let's take our mask and do this and this, okay? So, whoops, first things first, let's see, I could do an ignore mask, I think. So I'm right-clicking on here, and I'm saying toggle mask. So if I turn the mask off, and I'm looking, just by applying the effect, it's working, right? Look at the edge. It's blurring the edge, and now I'm getting less of that texture distortion, but it's blurring like so much stuff, right? It's too much, but it's giving me halfway of where I want to go. So what I do in this case, let's go back to our invert toggle mask here. So what I do is I start with a fill, and this fill is going to be my height. Again, I'm grabbing that height data, and I do just really crunch it. So it comes in like this, and I just crunch it all the way till it's almost black and white like this. Okay, so I'm getting this black and white mask. And whenever you have a black and white mask like this, it's really easy to get an edge matte by just using mask outline. So now I grab mask outline and I get this. Now in this case, for mask outline, the mask position, I'm doing both inside and outside. Start from black is set to false. And now I have this width and blur that I can change things with. And that's it. That's the whole trick. And so now it gives me this. So what you end up is, this is what it is before, terrible, and this is what it is after, better. You know, it's not perfect, but it's better. So now we get this effect. And now if I go into this mask outline, like I said, I can play with the width, you know, and the blur, stuff like this, right? And then I also have the blur of the filter itself. So at this point, this is how far we've gotten here on this little procedural material that we're creating. All right, so another little effect that I have on top of this is some leaves. So if I enable the leaves, that's what this looks like. And I'm getting these leaves here from Substance 3D Assets. So if you do a search here for leaves, you know, this is in the free assets. Let me turn that off. And there's a bunch of leaves in here. And one of them is like this atlas. Some of these leaves are atlases, like this one here. If I click on it, it's going to be an atlas of leaves. And so once I have this, I just drag this into my layer stack, and if we select the layer itself, you can see there'll be a mode selection, and I set it to splatter. And here, there's all kinds of options that I can change, like, for example, the splatter size of the leaves, the scale, the density, stuff like that. So I can get a bunch of changes and stuff like that. But that's what's happening here with this. Now, you'll notice in this case, I decided to turn if I have height on, then I've got to start to mess with a bunch of height. It looks terrible, and I don't need it for this. This is just a leaves on top. So I turned height off, and it just made it so much easier to deal with. So now I have these leaves. However, it's working, and my little blur is working. It's like the leaf, they're just like, they're melting along the side, right? But they're not stretching too terrible. It's okay. But you get this issue where like, I don't really have any shadowing. There's no ambient occlusion. What can I do with this? So a trick that I use is, well, I do have a filter for levels on here where I was just using that if I wanted to like, just tweak the color value a little bit, just do a little levels adjustment. But then what I do is I just anchor this data. So again, another pin at this point of this layer. And then I have this leaf outline. So what this is, and you can see what it looks like with it on and off, it's just a really quick trick to add to like fake some ambient occlusion in here. And I think that it helps just a little bit with the depth, right? And I have the blending mode for base color set to multiply. So the way this is it's just a color with the dark value, and then I come into here and I do a fill, I anchor the leaves, and in this case, it's just set to base color. That's where it's coming from. It didn't really matter. And then I do a mask outline. So here's the mask. Here's what it looks like, just these leaves. And I believe what I did was, so you can see what I did. This was base color, and I just completely crunched it down to get that black and white like alpha here. And then I threw a mask outline on top of it. And it just gives me the outline, and that's how I was getting that little shadowing. And I think it just helps, right? So if I have it off, they kind of look floaty a little bit. It doesn't look grounded. It's a little bit of something that just gives it a little bit more kind of shape, like form to it, a little bit more grounded. All right, and so here's the final result after just tweaking some of the settings, things like that I ended up with. And where this all comes together, this is the key moment, this is where this becomes a really nice technique, is that everything that we built has this entry point way down here at this brick generator. So like I said, if I wanted to come into here to the pattern and make changes, like for example, let's come in here and adjust the gap width. So as I start to adjust this, you can see that everything is coming along for the ride. Check this out too, this is cool. Watch this leaf. So as the gap is higher, the leaf looks like it's sitting up, and then what? It just kind of bends down a little bit. It's like it's being leveled a little bit, right? And so you can make all these changes and have this update. Now, where this gets even better is, check this out. I have a fill layer, and this fill layer is using a custom noise or a custom brick or stone pattern that I made in Substance Designer. Okay, and before we get to it, let me show you. It looks like this. So here's what I made. It's very basic little graph. In the end, like I said, this is what the map is exported. And I exported just a substance material file that I could then just feed over here into Substance Painter on the fill layer. Now, if I enable this, check this out. We get a completely different result to this entire scene by just feeding in, a different input map. So here's my brick generator, here's stone. And if I wanted to, I didn't do it in this case, but I could have had some parameters, but the random seed's here. So watch, if I change the random seed, I can get different stone tiles this way too. So this becomes a really, really cool way of going in and switching around your materials. You have this base entry point, and now I have like this entire layer stack that's like a system. I could say this as a smart material, really, and a system for driving different materials. And you know something else that might be kind of cool in here, since I don't have any levels effects built into it, what if I go in and just kind of change, let's see. Yeah, so here I can kind of vary the height and get some different effects like this here just by using this little levels control. So let's do something like kind of like this. So now you can see that because of all of my channels and how everything is kind of built together, things can update really fast and you can get different looks and stuff like that just by adding in another effect. But here is the end result. I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of this material. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.